I'm going to introduce my panelists in a moment. First of all, I don't know everybody here, so my name is Jedediah Morfit, Jed Morfit. I'm the head of the sculpture program at Stockton, in that I'm the sculptor. And this panel, just to give it a little context, is happening as part of a larger conversation that is happening at Stockton in general, in which we are sort of reckoning with the issue of being Stockton, and the name Stockton, and the relationship between Stockton the university and Richard Stockton the individual. There have already been excellent presentations on the history of Richard Stockton as an individual, and there have been presentations on the history of Stockton's relationship to Richard Stockton, which is an interesting story you should get at some point, but I'm not going to cover it here.
Can you do a tiny one?
So the relationship is really marginal, in that it was a naming decision that had almost no oversight, or not oversight, no, what would you say, Wendell? No oversight and no research, right? They sort of said, yes, they had a series of names, and then they decided that they didn't want any of those names. They wanted the name of a signer, basically. And then no one bothered to research Richard Stockton himself, who is not actually maybe a great guy. So this part of the conversation deals with the question of the monument, because I don't know how many people know, but we had a bust of Richard Stockton. We have a bust of Richard Stockton. Again, that came to us in a very roundabout way. But it is now in the special collections of the library, which is to say it is hidden. If you can picture the scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where they wheel the Ark away and they have top men working on it right now, that's where it is right now. I have a version, here is Richard Stockton. This is a scanned version of the bust that we have here today. Just out of interest, the Sculpture 2 class, which I'm teaching and which many of them are here today, have participated in this semester by, we took the bust of Richard Stockton and we took a scan of everybody's face and we have combined the two, okay? So in this way we're sort of dealing with the question of Stockton as an individual versus Stockton as an institution identity, right? So we're saying, in some ways, let us not focus so much on Richard Stockton, who is not the point. Let's say Stockton University is all of this. So we have many of these, and I have some of them here. And it's just cool to see all of the various heads. It turns out almost anybody can look like a founding father, which is fascinating. Who knew? All it takes is like some little wig things and a cravat. So I'll pass these around. You guys can have Richard Stockton or a
So
facsimile.
Each
person is Richard Stockton, right? And so we have many versions of Richard Stockton, and we could theoretically do this for everybody in the room if you all had a lot of time to be here, okay? I want to run through this because we don't have a lot of time. If you guys would keep it down. We don't have a lot of time, but I do want to run through this because it is my clear understanding that most people in this room have not taken sculpture. Most people in this room are probably not thinking about sculpture or monuments in particular, and I want to just do a quick bringing everyone up to speed so we can have a conversation that has a little more substance. So we're just going to, and I did this for the brown bags, so if you've already seen it, I apologize, but we're going to run through it very quickly. Here are some things that have recently been described as monumental. Facebook's recent data breach, the Goldberg variation, South Carolina's playoff games against the Blue Devils, and then things that are described as a monumental failure on the flip side: Donald Trump's presidency, war on drugs, the Nigerian military exercises. So just in terms of scoping out the territory, what are people talking about when they are talking about the monumental in society? In general, we come to a definition that is important, extensive, large. That's the sort of language definition. I would say if you look through those comments earlier, if you look through the earlier places where people are using it, people are talking about something that is particularly significant or definitive, right? Something that is very, very large is not by nature monumental, so there has to be an association that goes with it. We believe something, it signifies in some way. It would be a definition I would add to that. I've underlined to commemorate a famous or notable person or event because I think that is the definition that most people are most familiar with when we are talking about monuments, right? When we are thinking about monuments, it's important to recognize, and this is again the context for this conversation, that when we commemorate a famous or notable person or event, inherent in that commemoration is a declaration of cultural hierarchy and an assertion of cultural values and narratives. Okay, so, and this is what we are seeing with the monuments in Virginia. This is what we are seeing, in fact, with the Richard Stockton Memorial monument, right? Which is to say, is this where we want to locate our values? Is this a place where we elevate this individual, and why do we elevate that person? So you see it throughout art history. This one is courtesy of Amy Papalexandru, who has pointed this out to me. Here's Augustus of Prima Porta. This is the monument, the classic monument as propaganda, right? This would be a figure that would be left in communities, and copies of this monument were left in communities to sort of put your stamp on it. We've conquered here, and this is the Godhead. We've placed the Godhead here. This is the new regime. Again, just to sort of recontextualize this conversation, here's Robert E. Lee. This is the one that is under consideration for being removed. One was just recently removed in New Orleans. Is it appropriate to have a Civil War general on top of a monument in a city that is largely African American, or anywhere in America, right? Is a question that is being asked all over, and people are wrestling with what that says about their interpretation of history, about the culture as a whole, and that's where we see it. I like to include this just to provide some counterbalance. This is Sherman. This is William Tecumseh Sherman. This is his monument in Central Park. No one is talking about taking Sherman down currently, although Sherman burned a 60-mile swath of the South, okay? There are no monuments to Sherman in Georgia, okay? So this is a live debate. This is a moment where people are, where we are looking at each one of these and discussing the relevance and trying to figure out our relationship to each one. And it's a moving target. It's not something we apply equally across the board. Some examples that have been torn from the news. I'm going to just whip through these. Here's Joe Paterno, before and after, right? This is Joe Paterno having just died, and the fans coming out to decorate his monument in Penn State. And here he is being removed shortly thereafter as the waves of the scandal continued to break on the sex scandal in Penn State. Here's one that's happening right now. This was last week. This is Frank Rizzo in Philadelphia, who is, it seems to me, from what I can understand, not at all incorrectly being recognized for being a deeply racist individual. And the question of having him on the front steps here becomes a very live one. And I love this example of Hank Willis Thomas's pick in the background, which is newly added through the Monument Labs, my understanding, where they become in dialogue with one another, right? Where we have this Black Power monument right in context with Frank Rizzo really sets up an interesting dialogue. So the other part of this that we just need to touch on to make sense of the conversation we're going to have is, again, if you have not been following contemporary sculpture, and I don't know why you wouldn't be, but if you haven't, come on. It's important to know that in the modern era, really everything can be considered sculpture, right? If you have a vision of the figures that we're talking about, it is important to remember that now sculpture has opened up in every direction. So any process, any form, including no form, any material, including no material, and any process. So just some quick examples. Sculpture can be any medium. These are coffee cups suspended from the ceiling. You can see they're all, what are they? Styrofoam coffee cups, just beautifully overlaid. This is Tara Donovan. This is motor oil filling the room from Richard Wilson. So you can kind of see that the room doubles here. And it's a vast pool of oil. It can involve any process. Here's Roman Signer rolling a 55-gallon drum through a field of dowels, and where it ends, that is the piece. I had such problems with Roman Signer when I was in grad school. Made me so angry, and then my heart opened, and I fell in love. So just give it a moment, okay? Here's more of the process. This is Roxy Paine with these sculptures that are these beautiful, globby sort of forms that the artist never touches, right? It's just an automatically generated process, and so you have this beautiful sculpture that nobody ever had any intention about or ever touched. Creates a problem for you. Here's Gordon Matta-Clark cutting the house in half. I always say to my students in sculpture, important to recognize that not only did he cut the house in half, but he shaved the foundation by one brick so that the house would open, right? So it looks like a simple gesture, but it has complexity inside it for sure. And sculpture can be any scale. So here's, these are all from Antony Gormley, just because he does such a nice crossover from scale. Here's the little figures. Oh, and then there's I took out the middle one in the interest of time, but.
Oh, can I say something about the last one?
Yes.
It was also installed in a prison, an abandoned prison, so you could imagine how that would change the meaning of these thousands of those sculptures.
Absolutely. And well, and that goes to the next question, which is sculpture can go anywhere, right? So we can, it doesn't just sit on a pedestal, it can go any place at all. So allow me quickly, so new sculpture results in the expansion of the monument. Not obviously, we don't do away with monuments, but we have to use these new tools, new strategies to interpret monuments in a new light. So with that, let me introduce my panel. Hold on, I gotta get my stuff out. I have three distinguished panelists, all who have recent experience with contemporary monuments, and I'm excited to have them here because they offer a range of perspectives that I think we'll see is really interesting. Let me start with Steve Lane. Steve Lane, you'll excuse me if I read from my notes, but I'll get it wrong otherwise. Got his BFA at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art and performed the rare trick of making a living as a working artist ever since. Primarily based in Philadelphia, his work has been included in numerous group exhibitions, and he's had solo exhibitions at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, the Wexler Gallery, and the Artist's House. He has won essentially every award there is to win from the National Sculpture Society, including the Prusker Award in 2014, the National Sculpture Society Gold Medal in 2010 and 2008, the Edel Grant and the Gloria Medal. He was awarded the Gold Medal of Honor from the Allied Artists in 2011. As I think about it, Steve, the only one you didn't win is the bas-relief one, which is, you just might not have applied for it.
I now know I need to take you everywhere.
That's right, exactly. And he's been awarded numerous public and private commissions. And in 2014, and the reason he's here is he was appointed the sculptor of the recent Joe Frazier Memorial in Philadelphia. And if you haven't seen that, you'll see it in a moment. So let me just flip through. Sorry, and you can see Steve's beautiful work. So wood and bronze oftentimes. Steve also, students in my VIBA class will know, has one of the most beautiful studios in North America, certainly if not Philadelphia by itself. So beautiful work in a very traditional vein here from Steve Lane. And here is Joe Frazier, a long overdue Joe Frazier monument. Karen Olivier, I'm going to just read Karen's bio because it's so dense that I'm just going to read what she sent me because I couldn't write it for myself. Received her MFA at the Cranbrook Academy of Art and her BA at Dartmouth College. She has exhibited at the Gwangju and Busan Biennials, the World Festival of Black Arts and Culture in Dakar, Senegal, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Museum of Art, MoMA PS1, the Museum of Fine Arts, Contemporary Art Museum Houston, the Mattress Factory, Sculpture Center, Drexel University, University of the Arts, Ulrich Museum of the Arts, University of Delaware Museum, among others. In 2017, Olivier installed a large-scale commissioned work for Philadelphia's Mural Arts Program in historic Vernon Park. And I'm going to actually just drop down to that because that is really the conversation that we are having here. That is that's this piece here, and we'll talk about that further. She's the recipient of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award, and the New York Foundation for the Arts Award. There are many more awards here, and I'm going to skip to the end because I'm afraid we won't have time to talk to Karen Olivier if we go through her whole bio. Highly decorated, many exceedingly interesting things in here. And Caitlin Pomerantz here, BA from the University of Chicago. Let me go down, scroll down. Here's Caitlin Pomerantz. I'm going to go through these. This one is sort of hard to tell. It's a painting in front of it's a billboard of the building in front of the building. That's one of my favorites. Received her MFA from the University of Pennsylvania in 2016. 2016! For such a recent graduate, she has an extraordinarily deep CV with solo exhibitions at Traction Company and Edinger Gallery in Philadelphia and at the Adjacent to Life space in New York City. She's been included in numerous group exhibitions, including shows at Tiger Strikes Asteroid in Philadelphia and the MAMA Gallery in LA. She's been awarded residencies, and I was talking to my people about residencies elsewhere, from Philadelphia to Italy to Bangalore, India. She is an editor at Title magazine, of which Jacob Feiga was a founding member, and was recently invited to participate to create a public work in the Philadelphia as part of the Mural Arts Project that we're discussing here today. Okay, so this is a great panel, wide range of approaches and thoughts. And here's and there's Caitlin's piece for that, which was I've lost the title, Caitlin.
It was called On the Threshold.
On the
Salvage
Threshold.
Stoop.
Okay, so here's what I'd like to do. I have asked each of the panelists to start with, because God knows we hardly have any time. Thank you so much for coming. It's been wonderful. No, now we can actually have a conversation. But I've asked each of the panelists to start by using their work, their recent work in the monuments, as a place to jump off and tell us a little bit about their definition of a monument. And so I wonder if we could start, Steve, with you, sir. Would that work?
Sure.
I'll go back up to here. There we go.
Thanks for having me, and thank you all for being here. This topic reminded me of a lunch I had last summer in South Carolina. It was a National Sculpture Society convention, and one of the people there was from South Carolina, and the discussion of the Confederate monuments coming down naturally came up. And she started with, in her own words, she said, now I know that slavery was just awful, but she was apparently the great, there's some other great in there, granddaughter of General Lee himself. And so this conversation went on, but what I took away from it most was sentimentality overriding morality, or what someone is used to, or what we're used to traditionally, having greater weight or greater sway than the willingness to look at what is going on, what is relevant. To me, when a monument goes up, we're essentially engaging in a long-term relationship with this object. And the fascinating thing is the object never changes, its content never changes, but we all constantly evolve around this thing. And so there comes a time when we have to decide, are we relying on sentimentality, which is human. Everyone wants to be able to predict and feel that something isn't going to change. I mean, we all want some sense of stability, so overriding that's a big deal. So when I look at these monuments and I see them in a permanent material, frozen in a permanent material, frozen in an era, a certain culture and content, and this is the iconic figure representing that era and that content. To me, I personally have very little interest in the content of sculpture that I see, because it's transient and it's always leaving. I'm looking for something that is outside of time and culture and content, something that actually is universal and timeless, and something that lasts, something that is actually, to me, that is beautiful. When we look back on many old pieces, nobody cares that you know, Michelangelo's David's a biblical character and he's about to slay the enemy. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we all walk around in these human vessels, and so we have bodies. And when we see something that is beautiful, we resonate with it. And I think that is the thing that allows something to be permanent and timeless. Yet today we're in a culture that is constantly in flux. It's moving exponentially. So we can't count on religion or politics and make figures out of them and hope that that relationship is just going to go on and work indefinitely. So some things, I think, belong in a permanent state because there is something timeless about them. Whereas if the content instead is current, what is about our current culture, what is trending today, then I ask, well, what sort of material or what sort of timeline is that piece of work about? I don't want to go on because I know we don't have much time, but I'd like to just start with that thought.
Excellent. And I actually, maybe I would just like to send it to you, Caitlin, because Steve talks about long-term relationship, which I think is an interesting counterpoint to the way you're thinking about how this might be a starting point.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. When I come to the word monument, I think about the word itself, the root of which comes from the word to show, mon, so like demonstrate or monstrance. So a monument, I think, is something that seeks actively to show something about a culture, a time, and a place. Unlike any work of art or maybe even a public artwork, which could sort of be something for its own sake, I think what makes a monument quite different is that it's inherently tied to a public, and so it has this kind of built-in response system, and it's a conversation, a kind of deliberate conversation. My own relationship to monuments has not been to think of them as only kind of permanent works made of kind of strong, durable materials, but also what can a monument be something that is short-term? Can it be something that changes over time? And can that durational element actually become part of what the work is showing or doing?
Can you describe for us a little bit about the work that was in the Monument Lab here? Because I've got...
Yeah, so I was asked to come up with a monument for the city of Philadelphia as it exists today. And something I'm very interested in is in kind of the rapidly changing landscape, development that's taking place, rampant demolition of a very historic city. Philadelphia is actually the nation's only World Heritage city, and yet its architecture is among the least protected of any American city. And so if you take a trip to Philly right now, you'll see buildings getting torn down, construction all over the place. And so I really wanted to do something that thought about that situation. And so what I did here, I was assigned a public park that actually had a very important and interesting history. It had been a public burial ground. And the history was not particularly well acknowledged. It was something you'd really have to, sorry for the pun, dig up on your own. And so I was thinking, what does that mean? Is there any relationship between this site, this public burial ground, where all these bodies are kind of buried and their stories are essentially lost, and this situation with demolition and development? And so what I decided to do was to actually collect pieces of demolished buildings from around the city, and I focused specifically on stoops. I think a stoop is a really interesting piece of architecture. It's part of private property, but it functions kind of like public space. They're ubiquitous around the city, from the wealthiest neighborhoods to more financially unstable neighborhoods. You see them everywhere, and they're basically used in the same way, as a threshold to get inside and outside, and also as a kind of gathering space. And so I collected, with the help of several demolition teams and salvage people, a dozen stoops from buildings that had been torn down in the last 6 months. And then with the help of the Bricklayers and Allied Craftsworkers Union, we rebuilt them all for a temporary period of time inside the park. And this is a funny photograph that I submitted because there are no people.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the other photos, there's like
Yeah.
they become really social places.
It's funny,
People-
this makes them actually look like some sort of sculpture, and I mean they are, but what really activated them and I think made them into a sort of monument were the types of interactions that happened on and around them. And it was a really cool project because unlike other publicly engaged projects I've done where you have to maybe instruct people how to use the work you're creating, like before the barricades even came down, people were sitting on them, like kids were jumping off of them, dogs were running up and down them. So, you know, it was
Were they
really...
pissing on it?
What's that?
Were the dogs pissing on it?
There was some dog pissing. There was also a lot of nighttime skateboard.
Nice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that would be now. Well, hold on. I want to get Karen in, but I want to talk about the other one in a minute. Karen, would you let me get back to this here, and maybe you could lead us in
Monuments.
to this. Yes, to
monuments.
monuments.
Is so complicated, but I guess I could take my cue from James Baldwin. He has this great line that an artist's role is to expose the questions that the answer hides. And I think art is all about asking questions. And I also think about the talking statues from the 16th century in Rome, where there's a group of statues that end up becoming the voice of the people. People started writing notes on the sculptures. And then the sculptures were talking to each other, and they were kind of they were like a call to arms. People were using them as a site to protest against the civic and religious leaders and what was happening in the city. So I think about how that still today, they're not functioning as intensely then, but we're thinking centuries later, it's a site of revolution in a way. I think that about monuments as being, I have a hard time because I think about that, how they shouldn't be, on one level, they can be permanent, but if they're not engaging a site for discourse, if they aren't a space of an encounter for discourse, they're not functioning. If they're not a catalyst or a tool, they're not doing their work. If they don't ask me to do some of the memory work, there's a problem. I think if they act as though it's a period at the end of the sentence, that's wrong because history should always be written in pencil. So it's a tricky thing. I think when you were talking about the timelessness, to me that only works if it's in constant conversation with the present moment. If it's not a dialogical object, then it's not functioning. It has to. To me, it's important for there to be perpetual resolution. I think they should be functioning as a witness for us a witness or a mirror to ourselves, to see ourselves, our neighbor, our community, our country. And if they're not kind of demanding that I do some work, if it's not demanding that it to kind of address the past, to speak about the present, that talks about its implications in the future, then it should be gone. I mean, I do think there's some monuments that just shouldn't exist, that are in the public space, and we could talk about, the Confederate monuments, they shouldn't be there because they're political acts. We know about the timing when they came about. They came about after, years later, so it's like, okay, Jim Crow, let's do it now. Civil rights movement. Why are we building the Confederate monuments? And the civil rights movement, we know why, intimidation. So, so those monuments are one thing, but I think about, how different countries are dealing with problematic, monuments. You think about Budapest, let's make monument parks. In other countries, they say, let's take them off and have the pedestals are made, and thinking, okay, that could be a really charged site. That idea that we took off Stalin and now it's empty, but instead people are sunbathing. So that doesn't really work. So I think monuments are it's kind of complex. I think I'm off topic.
No,
Sorry.
you're doing right.
I'm
But I want you to come and just explain this project a little bit so that people understand
this
response to its monument.
So there was a monument at Vernon Park. I live a couple blocks away from this park, Germantown, and in the corner of the park is this monument dedicated to Francis Daniel Pistorius. That's not this. And it's in the corner with the ratchet straps. Really, people? Philadelphia. Ratchet straps for years. So I did research. I found out that he was one of the first German settlers. That's why the neighborhood's called Germantown. And I found out that he led the first Quaker protests against slavery. And there's a whole thing with the Quakers, like, how can we be okay with slavery when we're Quaker? So he led the first Quaker protest in 1688. So we're saying 200 years almost before it came to pass. So I found out that, so he's the bomb, right? And he's in the corner of the park. I found out that during World War I and II, they boxed over the monument. German, it was foreign, Germanic, the language. Fear is kind of like the cyclical nature of now, our fear of the immigrant. So they boxed it over, and I thought, and so in the central location of the park is the Battle of Germantown Memorial. Of course, a central, perfect location. It's dedicated to actually the only battle of the Revolutionary War that was fought in Philadelphia. led by George Washington. So of course it speaks about, like, it was a failed battle, like we lost that battle. When you read all the language, they make it sound like, yeah, we lost, but you have to understand how great this was. So it speaks about acts, who gets to have a monument. Of course George Washington will, he's the first president. So it speaks about who gets access, who has the privilege of it. So, but what I thought was complicated is, like, so you have George Washington fighting for the birth of America, fighting for our freedom from British rule, while owning slaves, and you have this foreigner who's fighting for black Americans, saying, how could we be okay that they're slaves in their own country? So I thought about the paradox of these histories happening, and I think about constantly as Americans, or not even, it doesn't even matter where you're from, it's constantly wrestle with the past. There is this thing where it's, what happens when things that are hidden come to light? What does that say about the status quo of what we assume to be truth about history? But anyway, so I thought, well, why don't I just take an actual literal history of boxing over the Pistorius Monument, and actually you do it on top of the Battle of Germantown Memorial. And of course I knew on some level they could read as irreverent. I knew, and I decided to cover it in mirror. So I figured I didn't want to just leave it at the history of boxing it over. I felt as though that's not pushing it forward, or that's not dealing with the present. So I figured if I boxed it over, it deals with the past, but if I have it covered in mirror, on one level it's going to reflect now it's a black neighborhood. The Germans are gone, they long left, the white folks have been gone, someone coming back. So all of a sudden now this thing makes reference to the history, but now it's reflecting the current demographic. But not only that, I thought monuments in a way, can they be both humble and grand? Can they reflect our true humanity, which is my joys, my disappointments, my, the beauty, the banal, the impoverished, So I thought, so it's reflecting the demographics, but the monument in a way, the sculpture never sits still. The idea that it's a mirror, it's always reflecting what's happening at every moment. So even if no one's in the park, it's reflecting the little breeze that's happening, the leaves that are shifting. And it kind of became, and I love the idea about, and I think about public art in general, they should be restless objects. They shouldn't be static and stayed. Once they become, and I don't think because it doesn't mean that the materiality has to be ephemeral. I think monuments can be permanent. Like I think yours is a perfect example, but still having a material that will outlive us. But what does it mean for it to be temporary, and how more impactful in a way that piece was temporary? I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Monument.
All right, well, hold on. So then I have a follow-up question.
Okay.
I'm sorry to be standing behind her. I had an interview once where they stood behind me. It was so weird.
Well, we have a chair. Should we get a chair?
I know. I have to get the mic. One thing we said in conversation before was it was important to you that this be a temporary installation, right? That it not, you could put a mirror over it, right? But you can't leave it.
Yeah, and for me that was critical. Like it was so fun because every day I went to the park, I'd come from the back exit, and I was like, it's gone. I'm like, Karen, idiot. Like literally, I would have a panic. And so of course it was a conversation with them, but I thought the idea that it was invisible, like this wasn't in the touristic part of town. Like I kind of wanted to do one there so more people would see it, but I was like, you know what do I do if I do a piece that's in a neighborhood park, so there's no tourists really. It's going to be people who pass this monument every day. They've seen it 1,000 times, and maybe they've passed by it, and they don't register it anymore because they've seen it too many times, or maybe they don't register it because of its kind of colossal, like heavy weightiness of the stone that they kind of don't feel like there's a connection with it. So I thought if I box it over in a way, me making it invisible will make people pay attention again. And it happened because someone's like, how can you covered over that monument? I was like, what was it? They're like, I don't know, some monument to somebody. But she's like, but when it comes down, I'll look it up. So I like the idea that the invisibility, the covering up actually kind of, it's going to have people have a reinvestigation. And when it came down, actually there was a re-interest, like this new interest in that monument.
Right,
so
right.
for sure.
So it has a moment where you draw attention, and then you have to do that. How does that, in terms of the culture, the Bilt's culture, is that if you sort of extrapolate with that, should monuments sort of be popping up and dropping off, kind of all over? Like, what do we do about the longevity of a piece like Joe Frazier, where it's going to stay?
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking. So my question would then be, can you think of examples of monuments that endure, that do the work you were talking about?
I always think of the Statue of Liberty. I grew up in Brooklyn. So every year you did a field trip there. And it's like I have that muscle memory of climbing those steps. I have the memory of being in that crown. And then I remember being a kid and just being overwhelmed by it. And I think about it historically. Then I think about when I was in college, I was a total radical. I was too much, you know. And you know, so it was like statue of oppression, you know. And that's what I called it for years. And then like now, I think about kind of like the deplorable state of the refugee crisis in this country and what that so to me, it's an enduring monument that's speaking with the current moment. And the Vietnam War Memorial is the other one to me that's like, how can that's undeniably alive and visceral. I mean, you see names, you see your own reflection, you're implicated, you become one. It's like the material, the black shininess, you can't not, it's just alive, you know, among death, you know?
I'm going to go back, Steve, if I could. What separates, when you were talking about being less interested in content, right? The content of any given.
Right.
So what distinguishes a monument from a sculpture then? You know, does everything then, are successful figures kind of devoid of that content? Or are you building without sort of that sense of content in it? You know, like, I mean, let's say I want a monument to something. I want to make a statement.
Right.
And you're sort of saying that is the part that sloughs off.
Okay. So for the Joe Frazier Monument.
Right.
Naturally, I studied him endlessly.
Right.
And I talked
you
to his
wanted
whole
that before,
family.
Just to go back, you were looking for that, right? Like that was a.
I created. There's a sculpture up there that I did beforehand, which was something I did completely on my own.
Right.
And there was a reason for it.
There we go.
That,
there we go. Yeah.
that one. So I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up in the poorest, toughest neighborhoods of Philadelphia. And I lived in Germantown for like 7 years, and I grew up in Kensington and so on. And I developed I'm 50 years old, I've lived there all my life. I developed a vibe for that city. Everywhere I went, I felt a certain kind of, I felt a duality. I felt a front, hard aggression, and a human being underneath. And that seemed to be what Philadelphia often felt like to me, where you have a lot of defensive pride, you have a beaten dog underneath, and that was the sense of it. So I was looking for something lean and hungry, and determined and devoted and all that. So when I came to Joe Frazier is, you could say, quintessentially Philadelphian, in that he boxed like a worker. He did his job, basically, which is what he was about. There's a monumental moment in his career where he's fighting Muhammad Ali and he knocks him down, and he knows that's it. He figures it out. But the interesting thing is he does that, and he doesn't throw his arms up or anything. He does that, and he walks back to his corner, as if that was my job today. It was a hard job. And Philadelphia felt like that, and so when I did this piece, the idea was to transcend one person and to create the vibe of a whole city. Mm-hmm. Now that, of course, also is temporary. This is our state right now. Fascinated with what you were saying. It's very interesting, and I love the interpretation of the mirror. It reminded me of, do you know what a Japanese no mask is? In Japanese culture and theater, there's kabuki theater with the puppets and everything, but there's also a no mask, and what it is an actor will wear a completely blank mask. And the idea is that people will project their own expression and content onto that better than any actor is going to tell them what to think or feel. And so that's what it reminded me of that. I don't know where I was going anymore.
Well, but I mean, in some ways, I was thinking about the difference between in the objectness of when you're really focused on Joe Frazier. You want to. It's not a no mask. You want to communicate so much with that, right? Everything about the way the weight is, the expression on the face.
Absolutely,
you're trying to tell
right.
a really clear story.
It's an underdog feeling. It's Philadelphia is an interesting state of mind. it is an underdog kind of feeling. I'm not really into sports. It seems like I get these sports commissions and I don't care. But but for him to drive forward, for him to be in a hunched position, all these things are kind of the antithesis of Rocky, which is not Philly at all.
Right.
And so I'm trying to go for something that is intrinsically beautiful and human, and to me that is beyond content and time.
Mm-hmm.
To me, in my own way, that is an ongoing dialogue, because I keep using the word resonate, but we resonate with that as human beings, and we probably always will.
Right.
So that's
Right. This figure you could tie right back to the Greek figure sitting on the
Yeah.
block, right? The boxer. They
Yeah.
could have a dialogue.
Joe
that
Frazier.
goes across both.
Yeah, he had an approach where he was absolutely willing to get beat up
Right.
to win, and that's an amazing thing.
I think it's interesting though. I'm so excited about this, and I
Oh,
finally
good.
saw it for the first time. And I'm a big Joe Frazier fan, but it seems like whether you want it to be or not, it's most definitely in dialogue with the Rocky statue.
Yeah.
You know, the most famous monument or
Maybe in
sculpture
the
in
world
Philly
today.
is Rocky, and it occupies this really central position right by the art museum. There are constantly people there taking photographs with it.
There's a line.
When really Joe Frazier was the true Philadelphia boxing hero, and
Yeah.
so why did it take until now to have a statue of him?
Right.
A lot of the lore that went into creating the character of Rocky was taken from Joe Frazier. It was Joe Frazier who was hitting meat bags and
Sides of the-
so I think it's interesting because even if the focus was on Joe Frazier and his history and his legacy, it seems like it automatically enters into a much larger dialogue about representation and
Yeah.
the choices that are made in Philadelphia for who is celebrated through public art.
We were talking about this. We were talking about this in another conversation that, in some ways, we're trying to think who you would personify in a sculpture these days. It's very complicated. Right? Everyone is going to be up for grabs, and in some ways, Rocky is the perfect example because he has no actual story, right? It's all a script. So you can nobody has a secondary perspective on Rocky that was like, he was actually horrible to his kids.
Right.
He didn't have any kids. He's just a story, there's no actual meat there. There's no
Right.
there in some
Which
ways.
allows us to project our story onto
Which you can
it.
just project, right? It's
Yeah.
just all win all the time.
Yeah.
Caitlin, I want to return to you because one of the main questions about, and I'd like to, if you would, I know this is not strictly where we are, but I want to talk about. Wait, where am I? Yes, there you go. I want to talk about this series a little bit, as is, just in terms of, this is maybe not so much a monument as public art, but maybe you could talk a little bit about, you were talking earlier about a monument has to deal with its audience and getting an audience to interact with it or respond to it. And here's a nice example of one that really specifically direct, exists and people are in dialogue with it very directly, and I wonder if you could talk about
Sure.
this a little bit.
Yeah, the kind of short version of the story, I had been watching this
Here, I'll go back
building-
up. There's that.
Yeah,
can see
I
close.
had been noticing this building in Kensington for many years. It's this two-tone blue building in the middle of a bunch of vacant lots, and I always found it to be beautiful. And it also seemed like precisely the kind of building that would disappear as soon as the neighborhood kind of continued to develop as it is. And so I had just thought, what I was trying to kind of figure out my relationship to painting, actually, which is what my background is in. And I thought, well, what does painting actually do, or what could it do? What does it do best? And I was thinking of painting as a kind of like devotional act, an act of paying attention to something. And so I decided I wanted to make this like 16-foot painting that was just a replica of the building, and to install it next to the building almost as like a billboard, or even mimicking the for sale signs or the coming soon development signs, just erecting it and seeing what might happen. And I figured it would just get taken down. But so I spent all summer making the painting. I went out there one day in the middle of August. It was hot. There was like dog poop and heroin needles and all this stuff. We're wading through the weeds to put this thing up. And I put it up, and I'm excited, and I, take a picture, and kind of, that's really the extent to which I had thought about it. And I got a text message from a friend that says, this was the next day, so she said, you got to get up here and see what happened. And this graffiti artist named Tober had tagged both my painting and the wall, like the identical tag. And it was this amazing moment where, I mean, on one level I was like, shit, I spent all summer making this painting, and this is what's happening. But I also was so excited that this, somebody in the neighborhood had kind of responded in a really meaningful way, I thought.
Yeah, in a way that indicates they really got it.
Yeah.
On some, right?
It was like 16 feet by 5 feet.
And so what happens, I didn't get a chance to ask, what happens when it gets painted over?
Yeah, so basically, a few weeks after that, the whole building had filled up with graffiti. About a week after that, the city of Philadelphia came and painted over both the building and my painting. So that was another amazing moment where this thing kind of became a piece of architecture. It became like its own entity. And so at that point I was just hooked as a documentarian. And it actually went on for 7 months, this dialogue between graffiti and the city and graffiti. And, in the graffiti, I have many more photographs. I made a little book. I did a video project out of it. But, it really became this conversation, and a conversation about different kinds of language, different publics, money, life and death, development. There were a lot of the graffiti was actually like RIP kind of memorial graffiti. Also this idea that the city of Philadelphia doesn't have money to fund libraries or schools, but they're sending people around to very quickly clean up pieces of non-architecture.
Right, to paint over your painting.
Yeah. It kind of highlighted all these things. And
what's amazing too is that the city basically, it seems, assumed that is part of the structure now. They never questioned it, right?
No.
They just keep repainting it.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing, so there's some additional documentation. At some point, 7 months later, I was thinking, okay, when is this going to end? I'm driving up here every day to photograph this thing. I'm really kind of tired of it. And I didn't know what was going to happen. As I had predicted surrounding this block, new housing developments, luxury condos, laying foundations for this and that. And there was one really windy day where a 4x8 sheet of plywood flew off of one of the construction sites where they were building these luxury condos and actually pierced the painting. And that was the end. So it was also this kind of amazing, I don't know, divinatory story.
Makes you feel like you wouldn't want to park in front of this building, or they'd just be like, well, it's got graffiti on it, just paint the car. Just everything gets painted with the same brush.
That's a good idea.
So in the moments we have left before this whole room is going to clear up in a sec, I want to ask a question. If we can sort of assume that there is no monument without political implication of some kind or another, right? That every monument carries with it a political, and you can describe political in all kinds of different ways. But if we assume there is no monument without the political, could you articulate some of the political forces in your work, intentional or otherwise, that came about in the making of or the thinking about your work in this? And some of this has already been touched on, but I just want to, particularly Steve, yours is kind of an interesting place where you might not see the political in that, but Caitlin has sort of already touched on who gets represented, right? In that
Who gets
question.
represented and why?
Who gets represented and why? I mean, that seems one avenue to sort of have a conversation.
Well, that's an interesting, and certainly a few people came up to me and said, well, you can do this. Why aren't you putting up a scientist or a great writer? Why are we promoting this? And it's a hard question to answer, especially if you're someone who is working to make a living and the public tells you we want this. Mm-hmm. And so the overall mass of people say we want this and here's why we want it. I've been astonished at the the Super Bowl win for the Eagles, and so many people come out saying this city is going through a renaissance. This helps the city so much. You can't believe how great this is for the city. And I feel like, the kids are still hungry, and the housing still sucks, and they have all these problems. Why is this a renaissance for the city? It's an interesting thing. Yet they think it really is, and that putting this figure up there.
You should explain a little bit, because you're doing that, right?
Sorry?
You're doing that figure, right? Are
Which
you not?
one?
Aren't you doing the guy with the kid? We talked about that.
Oh yeah, no, and there's a project for Mayfair, which is in the Northeast, and there's a corner at Mayfair, which is Cotman and Frankfurt. During a couple of the big winds, there were 30,000 people at that intersection up in. I grew up there too, up and around Mayfair, which is just very bland, working class, extreme sports fan kind of people. And they want several sculptures to be on the corners there of people celebrating, essentially celebrating sports. This does not appeal to me, honestly. I feel like this is the other end of what's so wrong with especially figurative work. There have been many times where I've seen an outdoor piece go up and it's not figurative, and maybe I like it, maybe I don't, but often I say, well, at least it's not figurative. Because it's so often so bad, and it represents something so trite, that I think that's the negative side.
Right. Yeah.
And I've ended on a negative note. But yeah, that's how.
Well, that's totally fine. Ken, I wonder if you would just follow up on that question, because there's a whole political dimension in all of the stuff that we're.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this. I guess, to put it simply, I think the subtle can be political. Anything can be political. You can put up a piece of nothing and it can become political. And in some ways, I think that that's more effective than, erecting a dictator on a pedestal. I think kind of creating moments for people to engage in whatever way is comfortable to them, essentially creating empty moments, can be a form of art making and can easily become political.
Political, yeah.
Yeah.
Does it, when you make do you think of something like this as a monument, or is it this is a art making?
I guess I was really thinking of it as more like a memorial or maybe a kind of funerary thing. The stoops, on the other hand, as much as people sat on them and drank their coffee and just enjoyed their day, they also reflected on what it was that they were sitting on, and the fact that this material, this Pennsylvania bluestone or King of Prussia blue marble, came from buildings that have been torn down, that the material itself was headed to the waste stream or to get pushed into the earth after, having been extracted through thousands of dollars and endless manpower. So, there really was a political element there too, and people quickly picked up on that. So I think something else to think about in anything you do or as an artist is to trust that people will kind of make their own meaning and bring connections to things, and you don't have to, you can give them some tools and maybe a place to sit, and then it'll happen.
And let them do the work.
Yeah.
Karen, can I ask you we didn't get to talk about this in the conversation, and I want to ask the same question, but I'm so curious about this. I wonder if we could do it at the same time. Can you talk about the Tetherball Monument? Does that have an aspect of this that we could talk? Because I am
not really
fascinated. Okay, we can.
Well,
Maybe we could just tell about it a little bit.
Tetherball is a game that I've never played, but I'm obsessed with it. I have this nostalgia for an imagined experience I didn't have, and then I decided for this commission they wanted me to do something with play and playgrounds, and all my ideas they said wouldn't work, and they're like, no, it's too dangerous. So I said, fine, I'll make a monument to the Tetherball. They're like, we love it. So I'm like, okay, the most boring piece, but no, I think it's kind of interesting.
Where is it?
It's in Long Island City near PS1,
Oh.
but it kind of functions as like a flagpole. And I think about playgrounds as this victorious space for kids. So in a way, it's kind of, I wanted it to exist in the play areas. I wanted
Right.
that to do the thing, but to me, it's not. I guess I was thinking how it ties into other playground stuff where it feels though we've become too safe, like slides or just kids are in cages. You know what I mean? So I think this is more in conversation with that kind of.
It's funny because, and again, this is coming up. Did you never play tetherball?
Never played it.
Because this so sums up my experience of tetherball.
Oh my God.
Like being too small, you know, you can't play yet.
Some guy,
And this is like the
a
moment
friend
of-
of mine is like, Karen, is that piece? My friend he did a video of him trying to touch it because it made me make it high enough so that no one can reach it.
Right, so I mean, to me, that's like a just out of reach symbol right there. That's
Totally.
like, it's not for you.
I love that.
Oh,
That's
this
good.
is resonating on this in a lot
love
of
that.
ways.
Does
you
it
know?
actually move?
No, it doesn't
Okay.
move.
We have a question in the back, sir. Yes.
Yeah, in the interest of time,
Yes.
I would ask the audience, we have some questions.
Sure. I was hoping actually, because people are going to have to leave now, so then this would be the moment.
I appreciate the assemblance of this panel. I don't think we're going to have an opportunity to have these three people here again, and I'm curious as to what brought the audience to a piece on monuments. So I'd like to hear a little bit from
Sure.
you.
Well, hold that thought.
I was thinking about the political. I was thinking about I remember when Bell Hooks was deciding to come out with a trilogy on love. I was like, Bell Hooks, you're my girl. You can't be talking about love. And the end, she's like, love is the most political act. And I was thinking about when I was setting up the scaffold for my piece. I had a vet in the neighborhood come up to me. He's like, how much did that cost? $25,000. I was like, you're a little off, maybe $3,000. He's like, why are we spending money on this? There are people starving right there. I was like, I live here. I know people are starving right there.
Right.
And he said, so how can we, people need to eat. I was like, okay, I understand people need basics. I get that. But are you saying you'd rather this be downtown? You want this to be an old city in Society Hill? Are you saying we can't have beauty?
Mm.
And if you think that, that's fine, but I think we deserve beauty too. Why can't we have 3 months or 4 months to see ourselves and see how beautiful we are? And why can't we have something that reflects our complexity, from prayer circles happening around my piece to the guy shooting up and staring at himself for 4 hours and seeing his high go for. That is the complexity of who we are. Why can't that be?
Right.
Are you saying we don't deserve to see ourselves reflected? In the end, it was like, who became like the spokesperson for the piece, like, so the artist.
She said,
but you
right.
know, it's
Really?
like, why, but beauty, like what? Because our neighborhood does struggle.
Mhm.
Are you saying that we could only have things that are efficient?
Right.
You know, are you saying we don't have a moment, we shouldn't have a moment to pause and to reflect and just be like, I'm here?
Right.
And it's like, and the fact that I had someone else say, well, maybe if they're spending all this money, they realize we're still here. They haven't forgotten that we're here.
Right.
So, I mean, I got different responses to the piece, but in the end, people realized, someone's like, someone's gonna graffiti it up. It's, what is this for? And not one person did anything. It was like a kid put a sticker on it, which had a smiley face, and it was like, you know, so that was in terms of politics and who gets access to.
Well, and I guess that's, I mean, in some sense, that's part of what I'm thinking when everything is political. I was part of a thing in Atlantic City. It was an art park, and it was, you know, a public art space, but that conversation was the same. You know, why are we spending,
Oh, I remember
why
that,
are we
yeah.
investing in this in Atlantic City? So just the use of resources to build something that is non-essential, right, or contested in some ways, becomes a political act. Somebody has decided this is worth it, and somebody is paying for it, and therefore not paying for something else. And so,
And that's
you're-
when I
you're
start to
implicated.
wonder, I start feeling as though public art is only functioning if people aren't thinking about the author. If you're thinking about the author, then it hasn't been turned over. It's not existing in dialogical space. If you're thinking about who made it, all that, I think there's something wrong. It's not ours, it's for the public to engage it. And if they're caught up in who made it, I don't want anyone to think about who's made, about me, with the public work. It's not mine, it's for whatever community, you know.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but the one in Atlantic City failed precisely because they had no thought about the public. The public pretty much hated everything. That was the question I wanted to ask. When people don't like what you do, I mean, you talked about Mylan's Vietnam sculpture. Well, remember?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
The veterans hated it.
Now they love it.
Not
They
all.
loved
Now
it
they like
quickly.
it.
Right.
But in the beginning, the veterans thought this
absolutely.
was sacrilege and
Totally.
had nothing to do with the lives and the sacrifices that they made. So, I mean, it's something that all of you have to grapple with. You're doing something in public art. I mean, Richard Serra's thing was removed. The Atlantic City sculptures have been removed. Early ones that were put up, people hated them. So, I mean, you come from a very rather privileged, you know, sort of intellectual space. And when you put something in their world that.
But it's a
quote.
problem, but I think it's an issue if you don't engage, you don't approach it correctly. You know, even though I was doing it in Vernon Park and I live there, I need to research the hell out of it. And I actually go to a different park in the neighborhood that's closer to my house, but I had to spend time in Vernon Park to understand. I was like, oh, there's oldies dance party every Thursday night? I didn't know. The old folks and the kids are I had to spend time. I'm doing a project in Nicetown, and I don't know Nicetown, but I had to
Right.
spend time. Doesn't matter, okay, I'm black like they are, but I don't get a pass just for that. I had to spend time, so I
That's
did
not too
so
nice,
much
though.
research at Nicetown, and then I had to spend like literally weeks of just me hanging out to understand how this place existed in it. And then if you do that work, you're not going to please everyone, but you're probably going to get closer to having a piece that you can relinquish.
Right.
If you just jump in as a thing, and you jump into a place and plop art, no one wants plop art. We're past the days of plop art.
I also think there can
I'm
be
gonna t-shirt
really
past the
like
days of flop art. That's what I'm just gonna. Yeah.
Modernism just doesn't work.
Right.
I think people getting upset about public art can be really generative and exciting and revealing. My favorite interaction I had with the Stoops piece was a recurring interaction with this older woman who was from Romania and had seen a lot of destruction. And the day the piece went up, she came walking down the walkway waving her cane saying, who did this? And I said, it was me. And she said, oh no, you're too young to have made something so serious that is reflecting on destruction in this way. And I said, well, I really did do it. And, you know, and she said, this looks like a place where houses have vanished, where history is being washed away. And all of her criticisms were exactly what I wanted it to be about. And I was more excited by that response than the people happily drinking Starbucks, sitting on them. So I think, you know, there are degrees of public annoyance, and what it means to put something in a public is certainly a delicate question, but I think people's negative responses can be in some ways more important than
In front of
positive.
the Pennsylvania Academy, which is this
Yeah.
beautiful old Frank Furness building. There's now, what's his name? The clothespin.
Claes Oldenburg.
Oldenburg.
Yeah.
There's this huge cartoonish paintbrush and
With
a
like a
blob of
plop.
paint at the bottom.
Yeah.
And it seems everyone hates it. I hated it totally at first, and now it's kind of interesting, and I don't even like saying that. But it's interesting how much it just stands out. But it's a logo,
Right.
and a logo is a dangerous and fascinating thing.
Right.
You know, I don't have more to say on that. I don't know what other people think
That's a
about
mic
that.
drop one.
That's right. The logo is a dangerous thing. Well, that actually leads me to another question that I've been sort of thinking about with this, related to the contrast between the different approaches here is, what do you think about in an approach to monuments that sort of favors the temporary or the temporal, right? What do you think about that sort of patina that develops over time in a community, right? You leave the paintbrush there, and even if everyone hates it in the beginning, over time, there's this weird, you're like, I don't know, I'd be sad if they took the paintbrush now, like even though.
Because they've claimed ownership of it.
Right, like you kind of incorporate these things, and there is something to be said for that. You see it layer up on itself, and so your thoughts on like how, where does that leave this kind of response to a monument or to public art? Is there a place, or are we just at a place where we can't really, where everything is going to be more short term?
Mm-hmm.
I certainly
Permanence is great as long as it's in dialogue with the current. As long as there's a context that's relevant
Mm-hmm.
for it. I think permanence is great. I don't want certain things to disappear.
Right.
But I hope it's in some sort of conversation with
Yeah.
the moment.
Right.
You say timeless, but it's not really timeless. Maybe just semantics. It's timeful. That's not a word, but but
But it stays relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about going through and seeing work, when you go to the Met or something, and you see work, you can still be in dialogue with people 500 years before you, right? Like relevant conversations with people who are long dead. So it doesn't.
Even Fred Wilson's piece, The Mind in the Museum.
Right.
He's like, I'm just going to go into the historical museum,
Just move
pick
it around.
things.
Yeah.
Now the metals will have, shackles.
Right.
Now
Right.
we're going to have in the fabric thing, we're going to have a Klansman's hood. It's all old stuff. He's like, but he's creating a new context
Where
for
it
it.
becomes
you
a new
know?
environment,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
So the Rizzo
Yeah.
in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
First of all, it's just awful work.
It's terrible, right?
It's
Yeah,
just so
terrible.
badly done. For me, that's the definite negative. But
There's no there's no timeless beauty to that sculpture.
no
Yeah.
intrinsic value whatsoever. But I was a little kid when he was mayor.
Yeah.
This is the 70s, and I'm learning about what police brutality actually is and what racism is, and I'm 12 years old. But I grew up and kept hearing the stories. Some people just loved him, but the Rizzo family loves him, and South Philly areas. And this is again my idea of, it's understandable that people have sentimental values.
Mm-hmm.
You can relate, you can understand, but where is the willingness to go beyond and say, this really stands for something that is destructive and
Mhm.
wrong. It is very, very hard to crowbar people out of what they want to believe and want to see and hear.
Mhm.
And that's, the statue is very politicized right now because it brings up those issues. So you could say something positive in that it surely is dialogue today.
Right.
Mm.
It becomes a locus it becomes a site for that stuff.
I also think
Right.
the human obsession with timelessness is, it's kind of beautiful and poetic, but it's also tragic. And we're, living in a time where we don't even, cities are vanishing, the climate is changing, what does it mean to obsess about whether or not Robert E. Lee needs to stay there forever? It's an important conversation to have, but I think, if only things could be timeless, they're not. And I just keep thinking about, there's a poem that Byron Pierce Shelley poem, Ozymandias, and it's the story of this great ruler, a statue of this great ruler and his decree, and but he's toppled and he's lying in the desert, and it's, his arm is on the ground. And so, we can aspire to permanency, but I just don't.
It's not
And we're not going to be around to see it anyway, so.
Well, I don't know about that. Well, but you make it sound innocuous.
What do you mean?
Like like I'm just thinking about the Starbucks thing going on.
Uh-huh.
Like this is like feels like permanent racism that we can't
Mm,
budge on.
mm.
So permanence isn't. I may have
Well, I guess
understanding-
I'm wondering if the obsession with permanence is what is behind it when we know that it's not.
Everything crumbles.
Yeah.
Well, there's a question in the back. I want to make sure we get to it.
So I could mention full disclosure. I'm a native Philadelphian. I went through the Rizzo era. I appreciate what you said about champion Philadelphia Eagles, but does not change what happened in Starbucks.
Right.
And for you, our Philadelphians, I grew up in the bottom.
Hmm.
You know what the bottom is?
Yeah.
I live near there,
I'm
yeah.
from the bottom. Put this in context. Richard Stockton was not only a slave holder, you have an African-American students, faculty, and staff coming to this institution every day. He was a slave holder. No one was naming institutions after slave holders in 1969. I'm not talking about George Washington. I'm not talking about Thomas Jefferson. I'm talking about naming someone who's a slave holder in 1969, who, by the way, was also a traitor,
Right.
a signer of the Declaration of Independence and changed sides in the middle of the war. And we have a monument called Stockton. Somebody explain that to me. As people who have built monuments, explain a monument to Richard Stockton. Somebody help me. I found out this information 10 years ago, and I'm saying, why does it take 10 years? Why does it take 10 years? Larry Nassar going to jail for 65 years. Praise God, he's going to jail. Cosby is on trial. why does it take so long for this faculty and this student body
Break it down.
in this institution
Break it down.
to examine somebody who was a slaveholder? What a slaveholder did to slaves far outpaced what Weinstein has done. Where's the morality?
Break it down.
Where's the morality? The FBI director says recently he is morally unfit to be president. This institution is named after somebody who is morally unfit. And we're not talking about it. And where's the faculty on this? Leaders of future leaders. When you take a stand, you can't take a stand on this one. I'm not asking you to march. I'm asking you to stand up when everyone else is sitting down.
Break it down.
That's what this is about, monuments. And you talk about, if people have a different perspective. My ancestors. My ancestors. I owe it to them. Wouldn't be standing here and I wouldn't have gone through Penn and Temple if it wasn't for my ancestors. If I can't stand up for them, who will? And I'm not just talking about being black. I'm talking about being human. This is a human condition. The principal of all my classes, we have more in common than we have differences, and tell me that's not true. I stood up for every other group. Gays, women, African Americans, we make a point, and it disappears. It disappears. Black Lives Matter is off the front page. With All Lives Matter. Well, if All Lives Matter, black people didn't have to say Black Lives Matter, would they?
Right.
So when is this institution going to look in the mirror?
And I worry about this, what's happening, because there's some institutions where it's so blatantly obvious that things, like this institution, sounds like that needs to change. But then I'm up for a commission in Kentucky, and it's for this mural that this WPA are what's showing kind of the history of Kentucky. So of course in the center there's these 4 looking like planters, and you know the slaves. It's a very sanitized version of, you know, all the black folks in the mural are kind of seeming like they're just musicians. But so they asked me to come up with a idea of what to do, but I talked to a friend of mine and she said, "Are you kidding me? This is what's causing all this controversy? A mural that on one level, yes, it's sanitized, but it wasn't on the level of, say, Stockton University. So there's a thing where some things are being imbalanced, where some things, so people are in a way like, oh, can't do another one of those issues with the black thing. But some of them actually should be dealt with, and some might be an overreach. Like, I don't think that the students want them to take down the mural. I was like, no.
Right.
And I'm glad they covered it up for 2 years, and now they're having an artist kind of do something in response to it. And for me, I was like, I'm not going to just do a reaction, because that doesn't make sense. I'm actually going to go dig back into that mural and do something actually using that mural.
Right.
You know, so that was a case where it was overdone, where I thought the idea of taking down the mural didn't make sense.
Right.
This is like a teaching institution, it's a teaching moment. How can we actually
Layer on
keep
that.
the dialogue going about this monument? Because nothing about this mural, it all shouldn't be destroyed. There's there are definitely problematics with it, but then you look at a Stockton, you're like, what the hell is this about?
I heard someone put it the death of nuance.
Right.
Right.
You know, that
Yeah.
not everything is completely on one side or another.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, to go to your, like, one thing to me is, in all of this, is monuments become the locus for a conversation, right? But there are moments as an artist you're like, it's woefully ineffective. We can only be the conversation point, right? But the culture is the culture, right? And so whether we respond with these little plastic heads, or there's nothing we can erect that will make it change that the culture won't make itself. I think about Susan Sontag talking about on photography. She talks about the image of the Vietnamese child on fire running down the road, and how that is sort of credited with shifting people's perception of the war. But she makes the argument, an image can't do anything by itself, right? Because you can show images of horror. There was that horrible image of the child washed up on the shore in Greece. Gets no traction. People are sad about it. They complain about it. They don't complain about it. They express feelings of sadness for it. but they make no change. So it has to be a moment where the culture and the art come together, and the gears connect, and that's when an image has agency.
I
You know,
agree, because with this thing, I had to go in front of the community board and all these people, and they kept saying, at the end of the day, I realized, you want this to be resigned. You want me to do a piece in response so this conversation could end.
Right.
Like, that's not my job. My job is to kind of bring up the questions. The fact that I want to do gold leafing speaks about Western colonizers who
Right.
stole the gold from from Africa. Like, I want us to talk about the complexity in Kentucky, and I'm all the way in Africa now.
Right.
I'm like, if you want us to make any artwork, to resign it, to resolve it, to put the period at the end, then that means you just don't want to deal with it. It has to be a space for questioning. And
And
it's
I
not doing
can't.
that. That's, as an artist,
Yeah,
that's all you're
but-
supposed to do.
But I also,
think Will is also talking about power. I mean, there are images. I mean, just think about this recent quote chemical warfare, where
Mhm.
that image actually allowed 3 nations to bomb
Mhm.
Syria. So that's because he had power. The same thing, Will, in terms of the naming of this, first it was called a college. I mean, people who had power decided it. I mean, our research librarian here made a wonderful talk the other day, and we learned that there were 36 different names for this, or whatever, for this possibility of Stockton. And then one man who had power, namely Richard Bjork, who somehow kept me on, decided he was going to let all the others sink to the bottom of the barrel. At least that's what, and Stockton.
He did more than that, though. He sent a letter to higher education.
Well, no,
and asked it to be rejected.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really wonderful presentation that she gave. So, I mean, with people with power and the notion of representation becomes extremely important.
It absolutely does.
Some
but-
images fall by the wayside, and others, if you're Trump, you can go to.
but
war.
also,
History's
just-
told by the victors,
Well,
no?
right,
I mean-
but you can't, no image by itself can do anything. No image has agency unless someone chooses to act upon, right? And so there's no image you can make that is going to say, I will build a mousetrap that will, I'm going to build the image that will turn this country against the Assad regime. You can't build it. You can only have that image intersect with someone who, or a community or a culture that uses that image and finds a way to connect with it. That's what Sontag would say. Because there are horrors going on all over the world, and I could paint you a picture of all of them,
Right.
and you can't, it's only the ones where there's that sort of magical place where, I don't know.
but also a school is not an image, and it's not a
Totally right.
sculpture, it's a
Right.
learning institution, and
Totally.
it's also, for better or worse, a business.
Right.
So if the customers are not happy with the way the business is branding itself, then the business needs to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I heard.
That's all I
in
have to
response
say.
to what you were saying, I was talking with someone one time, and then they basically said, the people get the government they deserve. And I didn't like that, and, but it does abdicate responsibility to say, people get the government they deserve. We made this, and that's why we have this guy. That's why we have this president. We earned this. This is the culture we developed. I don't know really how to get into that, but it does come down to, we actually are highly influenced, corporate influenced, and our culture is what it is. But we are essentially the body. We're the mass that makes the change. So it's not impossible that, to some degree, we get the government we made and allowed to happen. So I think that's an interesting part.
All right. This could go on, and it's so interesting, but it is now really actually time to wrap it up. So I want to take a moment in the 3 minutes we have to just say thank you so much to our
You
panelists.
had a
Thank you.
question of yours, too?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry,
I
yeah.
was just gonna say, the culture that we're in is very complacent, I
Right.
feel like, and that's why there isn't inherent change moving forward. And I feel as Stockton as a community would rather do nothing than make a decision on this, because it's problematic to somebody.
Right.
Whether it be one person or 1,000 people, they're just gonna be complacent in this bust in the library.
Right. Well, and the bust is the tip of
Yeah.
this much larger iceberg. We were
I mean,
just-
but that's what's sparking the conversation. If we never did this project, would we ever have this panel, you know?
I mean, our other schools, like Yale had
She said
a
it went the other
college.
way, yeah,
that-
yeah.
Yale changed the name of one of their colleges.
Yeah, it's
I
right.
forget who it was, but
Mhm.
I mean, it's maybe linking it to different examples
Totally.
could be a way to inspire people, or it can't be the only school
Right.
wrangling with this type of thing.
Yeah, everyone's got this.
And the misperceptions too. I mean, before I brought my students from the culture and languages section, I asked who Stockton was, and one student said, that was the donor, the founder of this institution.
Huh.
And I said, well, wait a minute, where did you read that? And then I asked for others to contribute to the conversation, and everyone was signed, they couldn't
Wow.
figure out he signed something. And I'm saying, there's an awareness that has to be
Yeah.
generated, has to be created, and we have to be very patient with this because it can, my blood was boiling, but what could I do?
Right.
It's our youth, and we're trying to have them question authority.
I remember the days in the '80s wearing my button, question authority. Oh, 80s. It's great.
Parental
Protested.
controls.
I protested for 4 years at Dartmouth.
Right.
That's all I did.
Relate to the game. All right, I want to thank my esteemed panel for coming out. Thank you so much. I want to thank you guys for setting up questions and for staying.